If one were to take a walk about the countryside a few miles from Holtwhistle, out from Northumberland and past the wall of Hadrian, they might spy in the distance the slumping silhouettes of an old barn and farmhouse. If they were to draw closer, they would find the whole plot quite abandoned and in a sorry state of dilapidation. The usual cheery sounds of cowbells clanging as their wearers graze happily in a breezy field, or the customary clucking of hens scratching about in the yard, are all eerily absent, and if, for some reason, one were to spend the night there, they might hear an odd, monotonous knocking sound. The reason for this, I hope, will become apparent as I relate the strange tale of the Wilkerson family, whose descendants are even still, at the time of my writing, burdened with the old property. Now, when it was the knocking first began is not entirely clear. Mayhap there is some old grandam who recalls her own grandmother telling the tale as her grandmother had told it, and so backwards down an ever murkier line of generation upon generation of tellers until our sources reached at last, but I doubt we shall ever truly know. What is known, however, so far as the story is to be believed, is that about 60 yards from the front of the Wilkerson house lay a great stone which was old when the bricks of Babel lay unbaked, and the armies of Akkad had yet to sally forth to win old Sargon his dominion. Upon this stone, when night had draped herself about the land, was heard the tireless knocking of a little hammer thumping fruitlessly against it. Those who passed by the spot on their late homeward travels all reported seeing a bent old crone wrapped all in a grey shroud of great antiquity, and crowned in a low black bonnet. Every night was the same. The old woman would sit perched like a nesting hen by the bulk of the stone, and hammer vainly at its side until the first rays of morning bid her shadowy form depart. For this reason, those who knew of her named her Nelly the Knocker. As the years passed, time and familiarity dispelled much of the initial dread the spectre aroused, for she had never harmed anyone, and even the incessant knocking became merely another instrument in the usual chorus of night noises. All this had been so for as long as anyone could remember by the time the Wilkersons settled there, and was so for nearly a decade and a half after. Then it happened that 2 of the Wilkerson boys had come into their own as young men, and one of them, being a shrewd and thoughtful sort, decided old Nelly had been working towards some gain worthy of all those uncounted years of toil. And so he, his father, and brother came to the stone at the height of daylight, when Nelly was nowhere to be found, lest she break from her knocking and command the night itself to swallow them up. They buried a little cask of powder beneath the stone, and set the fuse to burn till rock was sundered, and the venerable vault gave up its hoary treasure. When the clouds of man-made thunder had cleared, a glinting drew their gaze, a metallic twinkle that had long ago been etched deep into the soul of man, and tempted him always to greater and greater feats of courage, foolishness, ingenuity, and madness. Cold as old Pluto, whose darksome realm of death it dwells in, yet shining yellow as Sol and Victor. The prize they claimed that day were 3 closely packed urns filled all to the brim with gold. Now here, as most Wilkersons will tell it, the gold was secreted away successfully, that Nelly knocked no more, and that they all lived happily ever after in their new-found wealth. There are, however, a few hushed murmurings which tell another story. How the knocking never stopped, but merely moved 60 or so yards from its accustomed post to the Wilkersons' house. How the Wilkersons themselves grew more pale and sleep-deprived by the day, and of the subtle queerness which had entered into them and grew more pronounced as the years passed. How once merry and wholesome farm creatures became furtive, unruly beasts, nearly wild as manged wolves and strangely watchful. And all through the night a knocking, now grown hideous with an unfamiliar note of hatred, a repetitive, thumping tattoo which seemed to drive a blackened nail of malice into the very foundations of the house. Now and then a Wilkerson man with too much ale in him might let slip that Mrs. Wilkerson had taken to sitting up all night at the spot in the wall whence the knocking came, and give reply with her own little hammer. Years came and went, and the family seemed to hold out hope that the knocking could be outlasted, and would one day stop. But night after night the sound came as it had always done, and kept up till morning. The children spent most of their treasure in moving away, one purchasing his own farm closer to Brampton, and the other leaving the area entirely, in favor of the stern factories and crowded streets of old London, hoping perhaps the smoke of progress and industry might veil him from the older things that yet linger in the forests near little villages. Each had made offers for their parents to join them, but were always refused. The Wilkersons came to be seen less and less about town, until finally they stopped going out altogether. One day a rare caller came to the house to check in on them, and found poor Mrs. Wilkerson with a hammer lodged in her skull. Her husband was nowhere to be found, but the door had been left ajar as if in mad flight, and a set of faded footprints ran about 60 yards from the house, near where the great stone once sat, and there ended. Mr. Wilkerson was never found, despite a week of searching. The police surmised that he had murdered his wife and fled, though the older folk wonder. The property has since been left abandoned, and though it has long been for sale and at a price far lower than what it's worth, strange rumor born of stranger night sounds keep it firmly in Wilkerson hands. The road which ran near the farm has fallen into disuse, for though the house is empty and the treasure long spent, Nelly keeps knocking, as she has for as long as any can remember.